Hail Ogsal, my tribe, and welcome to the Modern Barbarian Podcast. I want to start today's episode with one of my favorite quotes from Michael Hoff's post-apocalyptic novel, Those Who Remain. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. Let this episode serve as a warning to you all that the weak have taken power, and that the hard times are coming. This cycle can be seen in every empire that has ever existed in history. The fall of empires happens when the society loathes hard men so much that it actively persecutes them and tries to prevent their creation. For then there are no hard men to pull them out of the hard times. Then the empire falls. I see this country on this path, and want to talk about some of the things that I have seen in recent years that make me think we are headed for those hard times. And that if we don't get some tribes of hard men and get them pretty damn quickly, this whole house of cards could be coming down. We are living in an unsustainable economy. What we have currently cannot be maintained. We have a Federal Reserve that can create money out of thin air. It's all digital. It's backed by nothing. The only thing that makes our money worth anything is the people's belief that the money is worth something. When people realize that it's worthless, that there is no backing to it, that they just continuously create more out of thin air, we'll see inflation rates go even worse than they are right now. Right. So for those of you I've just learned about some of this more recently too, who don't understand how the Federal Reserve works. The Federal Reserve is a bank that's not owned by the government, but is authorized by the government to be the arbiter of their money. And they can literally create money, right? So their computer systems have the ability to create US dollars digitally. Because most of everybody's worried about digital currency now. Most everything that you have is digital currency now. None of it actually exists in paper. Yes, you can go get dollars and still use paper money, right? I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But there is about 10 times as much money in circulation as there is paper money in existence. Think about the average person. How much money, paper money, do they keep on them? Most people don't keep any. Everything's done with cards. Everything's done digitally through computers. And the Federal Reserve can create these digital credits on a whim. Say a new bank opens up. They contact the Federal Reserve, say, all right, I'm a new bank and I need a startup loan as a bank. They will contact the Federal Reserve that will then create however much money they deem necessary, and they can risk analysis to loan this new startup bank. And they create it from nothing. Just beep, boop, beep, fucking money goes, right? And it's all digital. And then they loan it to this bank with a percentage of interest, and they get to keep the interest that they're paid back on these millions of dollars that they create from nowhere. And there's nothing of value backing any of it. We got rid of the gold standard. We used and relied on the fact that we were the most accepted currency in the world as our backing, right? Everybody believed in our money, so our money had value. But there is nothing of actual value to it. It is just paper. So this unstable economy is the first sign of trouble in this loop, in the cycle of hard men. Right? The weak have started coming into power and have started doing things that the hard men would not do. And they are cycling through and creating these hard times because they are weak men. Another thing that we see in this country now are the weak men banding together to steal, loot, and riot against the political movements of the strong men. So think about the anti, uh, the alt left or whatever the fuck they call themselves now, right? Your groups like Antifa, BLM, some sects of the LGBTQ movement stuff, the more militant side of that. Just nothing to do with them being gay, by the way. Just everything to do with their stance against strong men. They have become a tribe of weakness, and they believe all strong men are against them, so they stand against strength on its face, right? These are just some that I know of. I don't have any personal evidence of any others, but I'm sure there are others out there. But you see them, right? They band together and they go and they hold their little peaceful protests, and they burn things down and they destroy things, and they cause pandemonium with the intent of silencing the voice of their opposition, right? They think that if they can cause enough damage, they will be the squeakiest wheel and they will get the grease. That the government must listen to them because they must be stopped from destroying everything, and that they think they'll get what they want that way. And so you see them out there banding together, these groups of weak men, and hell, some women in these groups too, and they go and they cause all this problem to try and further their cause of weakness, because they don't know what strength looks like, or they believe strength is toxic, and that their worldview is somehow better than all of ours because they believe in this communist utopia or whatever, that we can all, live as one and get along, and there will be no more tribes, even though they are creating tribes and literally shoving other people out. They are doing exactly this thing that they say they're against. They are banding together to create tribes against a different type of people that they don't like, and not tolerating those people and telling them how wrong they are, and then dehumanizing the group that's against them, which is exactly what they are against. They are doing what they say they are against. So, again, the mental gymnastics that these people have to do to stay on the side that they're on, to believe what they believe, that they're in the right and that they are punching Nazis in the face, right? Like, get the fuck out of here. It's just another sign of the hard times to come, when weak men are allowed to behave in such ways. Then you see the weak men in power protecting the weak men who vote for them and destroying those who don't. So in these uprisings that we talked about, Antifa, BLM, these peaceful protests as they call them, right? They loot, pillage, and destroy, and cause these huge problems for the cities that they're in, and just literally steal everything they can get their hands on, burn shit down, and call it a peaceful protest, and are backed by the politicians who say, yes, it's a peaceful protest. We've offended these people. We've done this crimes against humanity against them for so long that they have a right to break the law and all this stuff, right? But then there's no arrest against them. They're not held to account for any of these things. But then look at what happened on January 6th. It's called an insurrection. Some people go to the Senate and try to hold their senators accountable for not following the Constitution and not doing the things that they're supposed to do. And it's called an insurrection, right? Think about that. An insurrection. I can't imagine that that's an insurrection. And we've talked about some of this before, but they're so scared of being held to account by the people that they let them be killed for trying to get near them. And they hold standards for the people that do not apply to them. They write it into the laws that these laws do not apply to them. They only apply to the people. And it's a cycle of weakness perpetuating weakness. We allow the weak to run for office and think that we have to vote for them because there are no other options, right? We're given 2, maybe 3 choices for each position, chosen by the elite, chosen by the ruling class, and they tell us, oh, here's your options, pick one, and they call that freedom. They call that voting, because they pick all the options, and then we are led by the nose to our voting stations to tell them which of the options we think is the least shitty, and that's our freedom. But anybody can run for office, they'll say. Anybody can do it. But they've made it so expensive, they've made it a rich man's game. Because now you need to go to the national outlets of the media and pay them millions of dollars to run your face on campaigns all over the country for name recognition so that you can get voted for. And if you can't afford to do that, you can't be elected. That's just the facts of life. They've made it a rich man's game. They have turned it into a profiteering scheme. Because I tell you right now, these people are not doing it for the good of the country. No person spends millions of dollars to get a job that pays $170,000 a year. It's not a feasible long-term strategy, right? Now, we could honestly believe that they were doing it for the good of the country, that they believed so much in what they were doing that they were willing to spend their fortunes to become leaders of this country to try and help it do better, then maybe. But every single one of them enriches themselves while they were there. Every one of them. On both sides. They gain this power, and then under the table deals without following the rules or telling us they're doing it, they sell themselves out for influence to become multimillionaires while making $170,000 a year. They manipulate the stock market and are allowed to trade in it so that they know things are coming and what's going on and what's going to be legalized and what's going to be the next big thing. And they buy it before they tell anybody about it. Then they legalize it and their stocks quadruple or, even more in value, and they become rich off of that. And that's not called insider trading. And rules about it do not apply to them, only to us. These are the weak in power. They have no honor. They don't follow the disciplines and believe in the things that we believe in. They don't need to be strong physically because they are surrounded by people that they can buy that are strong for them. Their mastery is only the mastery of the art of deception to keep themselves in office so they can continue to be rich and powerful. They have no honor, none whatsoever. They sell themselves to the highest bidder. These are weak men and women, and they have risen to power, and that's what has happened to the country and why we're in the state that we're in, is the weak have risen to power, used that power to become wealthy, and locked the strong out because they cannot afford to compete for the positions of power. Another another sign of the weakness invading our country is on the non-leadership side. We have weak men accepting tyranny for safety, right? We talked about it last week in the safety culture that they've created intentionally, that all the weak men are afraid now, and women. They're all the weak ones, afraid of everything, right? And so, with this mass fear that they've instilled in everyone, they're now telling them they can trade their civil liberties back to the government to make it easy for the government to keep them safe. And they believe that that's a good idea because they want the bonobo masturbation society. They want to be able to eat their fast food, sit in their house, and watch their friggin' porn videos. That's the pinnacle of life to them. That's all they have. That's all they think about. That's as far as their aspirations go, is to be comfortable and live in that cycle of fast food, cheap house, left alone, MySpace, play on the internet lifestyle. They don't want to build anything. They don't want to create anything. They don't want to master any skills to actually be worth money to society. They want to demand $15 an hour for entry-level menial jobs that are not designed to support families, and say that, well, we have to have them, and so I should be able to make a living doing this shitty job. And it's because they have no skills. Those are entry-level jobs because they require next to no skills. Now, you'll learn a skill. I used to work fast food when I was a teenager, right? Back before I grew up and had a family and needed to be able to make real grown-up money. I worked in the fast food industry too. And yes, there were some adults there that made a good living. They were in the management side of it. They'd work really hard to become managers and stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that go back there and you know, put the hamburgers together. Or, you know, work in a kitchen or work on the line or waitressing or whatever. And yeah, there's a lot of people in those positions that are not entry level anymore and they like it, but I guess. But this demand for $15 an hour to be able to do this job that literally you can grab a teenage kid off the street and have him do it in a matter of minutes is asinine. There is no reason for this. But there's enough weak people. They outnumber the strong so much now due to the corruption and fall of our society that they are the predominant voice. And to be fair, the weak have always been the predominant voice. The strong have always been a minority. But because of the way society was modeled in the past, the strong held the power and they could keep the weak at bay and keep things moving forward for the most part. And that's where you see great empires built. That's where the king archetype comes from, right? These strong men who rise to power through their strength and then create these empires of strength and find the strong and put them together and become something great that lasts through the ages and through history. Which is part of the reason we see such a push for the destruction of history now, right? The rewriting of history, because the weak that exist today have come to power and they can no longer stomach the stories of the strong men of the past, so they must defame and destroy them. They must profane their names in some way to make them seem less heroic and less of a good, strong role model for people, because they don't want anybody to look at them and compare them to these people, because they would pale in comparison. So they claim to not want the same things, even though underneath it all they do. They wish they were strong. That's why we have this problem with the appearance of strength in the world today, where everybody wants a six-pack and a 0% body fat, right? Because they think that's what strong looks like, even though it has nothing to do with it. It's an ever-perpetuating cycle of weak men. And back to them accepting tyranny for safety. They're selling their rights to the government for the illusion of safety, right? We'll touch on the big one here is the Second Amendment. In this country, that is the right to keep and bear arms, and it is constantly under attack in the guise of public safety. They take anything that they don't think a civilian should have, that only their government Gestapo people should have, and they call it a weapon of war and an assault rifle and designed for mass murder, and they try to ban you from owning it to defend yourself. They tell you that you can only have 10-round magazines. Luckily, that was just struck down. We'll see how long that lasts. But and that somehow if you can put an 11th round in a magazine, that it now becomes a weapon of war and is infinitely more dangerous. It's just a made up arbitrary number. The goal is to give them the advantage. What they are afraid of is strong men. And they know that they cannot face the strong men in this country. There are too many of us, even though we are the minority. There are too many of us, too well armed to overtake. So they need to start skewing the odds even more in their favor. And that's, they talk about wanting that all the time underhandedly, right? It's this whole claim that if you want to go to war with this government, you need F-18s, right? Like, we can't bring a fighter jet down on the ground. Any of you that grew up with a granddad probably have a bolt bucket laying around, right? Did you know that if that were to be spilled on the runway, that would down that entire runway for hours while people had to individually walk up and down it to pick all that up? Because the intakes on the jet can literally suck that off the ground and suck it through a jet engine and destroy it. One little tiny nut goes through a jet engine and that engine's done. Has to be completely disassembled and rebuilt. Yeah. But better be scared of all those big fighter jets, right? Did you know that when they're on the ground, you can take them and make them near unflyable by damaging the landing gear while it's down? Yeah. Or contaminating the hydraulic systems. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things that they don't tell you about their mighty invincible fighter jets, right? Or their bombers or whatever. Because they don't want you to know how vulnerable they are. And all it takes is self-sufficient men willing to live self-sufficiently with no government safety, well armed, to make this country impossible to take back by the federal government. You don't believe me? I know it gets old to hear, but look at what happened in our foreign war. Afghanistan, we may not like those people. You may or may not, I don't know. Right? But they are tribal people. And they were self-sufficient men who knew how to fight and were well armed. And as they were fond of saying, the Americans had all the watches, but they had all the time. They were generationally prepared to defend their lands, to defend their freedoms, to tell the foreign invader who had different ideals and beliefs than them that they would willingly die for generations to keep them out. That's the kind of things we have to be willing to do. That's the kind of hard men we need to be. That's where they're at in the cycle. And in their minds, we may disagree, but they're creating the good times that they want in their country, right? They are a patriarchy, and they have the strength to maintain a patriarchy because they want a patriarchy. That's what they believe is the good times, and that's what they're creating. And I know that word is taboo in this country now. But every empire, every country that has ever come to pass and exist and be on the books in our history, in the history of the world, has been started by a patriarchy. Why? Because it's the model of all of human civilization throughout our entire history. Men fight and build and create. Women maintain and care and hold a tribe together. The men go in to the world and do the dangerous shit and create the boundary of their tribe. And then they protect that boundary. And then they hunt and bring food in right? And protect from the outside and the foreign invader to make this boundary safe. And inside of that boundary, the women do the cohesiveness of a tribe, right? Which is critically important. And for some reason, they think that being in that role has deemed them a second class citizen, like we would ever have existed without the women in the tribe being the ones to bring it together and keep it cohesive and to reproduce and to always be there as kind of a moral compass, right? We all know if you piss off the queen, she sends the king and his men to take care of you, right? There's a lot of power there, even though it may not be the one in charge. There's a lot of sway over the one in charge. So it's always been a very powerful position that women have held. But modern society has told them that this position is actually a second-class position. Hold on. That was a spider. Get rid of him. Boom. Anyway, part of being in the underground, right? Sometimes you get the spiders popping in. You just got to kill their little asses. But back to what I was saying, that women have been taught by modern society that role made them a second-class citizen, as that they were seen as subservient to the men because the men held the true positions of power in their eyes. And any woman who actually lived in one of those positions would tell you that was quite the opposite. They didn't have to go out and face all the dangers. Their men would do it for them. They were allowed to make their own choices and live their own lives in a protected thing and raise up their children and build their homes and have their hobbies and do whatever it is they wanted to do in a completely safe and secure environment, so provided by the strong men of their tribe. And now look at what they get, right? In modern society, they are typically passed around and used by men that will not ever marry them. There is a huge push about body count right now because women have gotten to the point where they're willing to sell themselves and trade one of their most valuable commodities to just about any man out there for a dinner and a few drinks. And they've lost their self-respect. And they think that is a better position for them than what they would have been in a tribal society, where they would have been held as the most important thing in that man's life. Which is ironically what they want now, even though they've created this other system for themselves where they sleep around and party their early years away and then think that they're just as valuable later, even though they've been run through by so many people that hell, you can't go out with one of them without running into some guy she's been with, right? And they wonder why the strong men don't want that, why they don't want something like that, why they don't want a woman that would allow that to be done to her. But they still want a man that is willing to make his world all about her and do everything to protect her and be capable of protecting her and providing everything for her. But he can't be a strong man because the strong men are toxic. But he needs to have big muscles and a six-pack. But he can't have a strong mentality. And he can't be overly dedicated to anything other than her. You see where I'm going with this? It's this fantasy illusion, mostly created by models in Hollywood, that you can look this way, but not be dedicated to taking care of yourself too much. And that she can be the most important thing, but you've still got to make like multiple hundreds of $1,000s a year to be able to perfectly provide for her, but you can't care too much about your job over her to be able to make that happen. Yeah, And then they wonder why they're alone. Because they created a society full of weak men and then yearn for the strong ones again that they still believe are toxic. They want the weak men to be the strong men without being strong. That's never going to happen. So, another thing that I want to talk about in this cycle that is sending us down the wrong path is the lack of self-sufficiency, even among the strong men in the world today. Very few, myself included, still operate a garden. Right? I don't have the current space. I am working on that. I'm learning that skill, right, in a very small scale, keeping something small going. But I do not have the space nor the knowledge to grow enough food in a year to feed myself, let alone my family. I am still overly dependent. And I know many of you out there are in the same boat that I am, right? And all the strong men out there, for the most part, are in this because they make it so difficult to not be intentionally. But we can do better, right? We can increase our self-sufficiency. We can set that goal for ourselves and continue to get better. And we must, right? Because until we are self-sufficient, until we can take care of ourselves without any outside help whatsoever. Now, that doesn't mean no trading or whatnot. You're always going to have community. You're always going to have neighbors. Don't hear that the wrong way. That's a critically important part of it. But until we as small tribes and communities can become self-sufficient, we'll be easy to control. They can turn off the food supply, they can turn off the power supply, they can turn off the water supply, and most of us would have to either die or go crawling back. But we can set that goal to take that power from them. We can learn to do our own power generation and survive with less power. We can learn to make our own food and water and grow it and hunt it and husbandry it. That's what we call it when you raise animals. Animal husbandry, right? So you can grow and raise all this for yourselves and become more and more self-sufficient, which we should all be working towards because it makes us unrulable. If we have the ability to care for ourselves, we cannot be conquered because we do not need anything they provide, and we can take ourselves and our skills, even if we have to leave our homes, we can set up somewhere else. So it's important that we learn to be truly strong men. Because for the most part, right, most of us still alive, we're just now starting to see the beginning of hard times, which means we grew up in the easy times. So even as the strong men of the easy times, we're not fully strong men yet. We are not self-sufficient. We're not already in tribes, even though we're working on it and trying, right? And we still rely too much on outside resources. So we're the strongest of the weak men, but we're not fully strong men yet, and we have a long way to go. So I know many of you've heard me talk about it now, and you like to know the history of stuff, or at least I like to talk about it. So let's look at some examples of this cycle in history so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go overly into detail on any of these. I'm going to give some examples and the little bit I know just off the top of my head. And if one of them interests you, you can go research it, right? But it gives you some starting points of talking about, seeing what I'm talking about. Let's start with the French, right? Back in the day, the French were an empire and a very strong empire. And as the strong men in that empire created the good times started to create the soft men, the weak men, right? So you started to see a ruling class that became obsessed with socialites, parties and social status and no longer cared so much about being strong and ruling the country. And things started to fall apart. And you get the famous lines like let them eat cake, right? And then you see the French Revolution, which was the real hard times created by the weak men, and the strong starting to rise up and take it back to fix it. Again, not a history major, not trying to be your teacher, just giving you a quick rundown of it. So if that cycle interests you and you want to see more of it and how history repeats itself, take a look at that. One of the things to know of the French Revolution, though, before I get off of it, the reason that it failed and then things didn't work out the way they wanted it and not near as well as, say, the American Revolution, is the French became obsessed with revenge. After they had tossed the social elites out of power, they were unable to come together as a country and work together to rebuild. They were obsessed with revenge. They were busy hunting each other down and trying to kill all of their political enemies instead of building a country. So, key point. Another cycle of this hard times, weak men cycle, right, comes from Britain and leads to the decline of Britain and the American Revolution, right? So, in the early days, strong men in charge in Britain, they were the powerhouse of the country. They had the world's largest navy. They were the most powerful country in the world. Hands down, could take out anything, right? And as that started to create easy times for their country, they were shifted their focus away from strength and again more towards social status and things like you see over there now with the obsessed by the royal family and everything's about tea parties and fox hunting or whatever the hell they do over there in Britain, right? And they went from the world's largest empire to back to just this little island country. And you also see it in their earlier times at the beginning of their decline, right? They lose the American Revolution because they lost the ability to be strong, right? They still had it, the world's largest navy, and they still had strength, but they lost the ability to use it. Everything was a hearts and minds game, and they didn't have the stomach for real war anymore. And the few that did were told they were not socially acceptable. That's not how an officer should behave, and that's not how a socialite should behave. And the hard men in the early Americas, people that could move to an entirely different country held by indigenous people with absolutely no resources set up there to take care of them and build a country out of it and survive in that, those are hard fucking men. Harder than we've seen in a really long time. And they put the hurting on the British, right? Because that's what happens when weakness fights strength. Weakness always loses. And then the last one I want to talk about is the fall of Rome, right? So if you know the story of Rome, I'll give a little bit of the backstory that I know. This is not coming from, a historian, so grain of salt here, right? But there's two brothers, Romulus and Remus. They go out and they decide to start a city. And they've got some men with them, and they put this all together, and they build up a small little city, right? But they know that the city will die unless they get some women in there, because right now it's just men. And any tribe knows you must have women in your tribe in order to survive. So they go, yawning today. But they go to some nearby cities and they tell them, we want to marry your women. We want to get to know some women from your villages that are single, and we want to marry them and take them back to our city. And at the time, they were all told no because they were a new city and they didn't have any standing and they appeared to not have any strength, right? So, rejected and dejected, they go back to their city and they make a plan, and then they go out and they start conquering surrounding cities and they take the women, right? So they would go on these big raids and they would conquer a nearby city and they would capture the single women. I'm assuming they may have taken married women, I don't know. But mostly they took the younger generations, right? The marriageable age back to their cities. And they made wives of them. And when the other cities would finally get enough strength back up to come and try and take them back, they didn't want to go. The wives had fallen in love with the strong men, even though they had started as captives. Again, how the story goes. Right? So you see that they used strength to get what they needed. Maybe not socially acceptable now, but they knew that it wouldn't exist if they didn't. And Rome became the largest empire to ever exist due to the strength of men like that. Whether we agree with their philosophy or not, that was strength, right? And so it eventually turns into Rome, built on the backs of men like that. But then again, you see the same thing that's going on in this country right now, almost identically. They start to build a lot of wealth, and then they get a socialite, elite, wealthy class. That wealthy class turns being into power in that structure into a money game. Unless you're rich, you can't afford to play the game. And so they take over as the ruling class, and they become socialites, obsessed with food and drink and games and ruling, and they lose sight of being strong. And it leads to the decline of their entire empire, and now it basically doesn't exist. This Rome last vestige is a city that's there because the Pope's in it, right? The whole thing has come crumbling down, and they lost sight of maintaining strong men because they got in. Strong men created the good times. Good times created the weak men. Weak men took power, pushed the strong men out, and they weren't there to save them when the hard times came that the weak men created. So, as the strong, we have some choices to make, right? We can decide that we still believe in the American idea and that we will band together as tribes of strong men and we will save America when the hard times come. I don't know that that's the right option. I don't know. Maybe you need to let it fall to be able to be fixed, right? Maybe it's time to redo some things. Because while I still believe in the idea, right, the Constitution and the idea of the republic that those men created, it has been corrupted and tainted for so long that it's almost unfixable. It's kind of like having to amputate a limb to treat gangrene, right? This country is gangrenous. It has been infected with weakness. And the only cure is to cut the weakness out. And that can only happen one way. So maybe stopping it from falling isn't the right path to ultimately save what we're trying to save. Something to think about. But with that, we're going to start winding it down, right? So let's go over some conclusion stuff. For conclusions, what did we talk about today? Well, we talked about the cycle of hard men, right? Sorry, I got to open something real quick here on the old computer. Get slid around there for a minute. And realize that I jacked it up and do it all over again. So here, put you right here so you're not in the way and not staring at that light. And we will try this again. Caps lock's on. Don't you love that? You're sitting here trying to do something and you accidentally turn the caps lock on and you can't put in a friggin' password to save your life and you can't figure out why. And then you finally figure out what it is. So, anyway, the reason I needed to open that is we need to go over our social media stuff, right? Remind you guys what's out there. And I keep notes so that I don't jack it up. And I forgot to print those today. So, yay me, we're going to look at them on the computer. But while those are opening, finish up the conclusions. We talked about some history of this, of the hard times to come as I cycle through history. We talk about what we see in this country and heading that direction. But mostly it's about the cycle of hard men. So remember this. Strong men make good times. Good times make soft men. Soft men make hard times. And hard times make strong men. The hard times are coming. And they're already partially upon us. And that's why we see this resurgence of strength, even though it's kind of an underground movement. And it's your responsibility to be ready for these hard times as they are coming. You need to have your tribe together. You need to be able to defend your shit. You need to be able to keep your people that you love together and safe. One of the ways you can do that is by building a tribe. And a place you can go to help build those tribes is the Modern Barbarian Podcast social media. We got a Facebook page for the Modern Barbarian Podcast. There is a Reddit subforum if you're into Reddit. There is a Twitter page called the Modern Barbarian Podcast. There's an Instagram page. We've got Spotify and Apple. We're on Tumblr. There's a Patreon. There's even a YouTube. Like, it's all out there, right? All for the Modern Barbarian Podcast. Links will be in the show notes. So, if you're watching or if you're listening, please like and subscribe. Hit the buttons on the little thing. Tell it to tell you when new ones come out. Share it with your friends and your families and your tribes if you think that this message would help them. If you think this message is important to the survival of our country, please share the videos, right? I do this because I care about the strong men out there and their tribes. I need you to help me get the word out so that they can start building too, and they can start realizing that they are not alone, and that we can start organizing these tribes together. You'll still be your tribe, I'll still be mine, but we'll know each other exist. We'll have support, right? We can work together. So use the social media that I put together for this to help build the tribes, to find each other, to get together, to know what's going on. And with that, we're going to call it a day. This is the Modern Barbarian, signing off.